Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another rendition of Philosophical Talks with S.Friedman. We're very excited this week to have Stephen talk about the dignity of differences and a little more on happiness. This is especially important talk because we're just finishing up Black History Month and we're starting off Women's History Month. Throughout history, and go into the philosophical perspective on this, but just from a general perspective, you know, throughout history, differences have unfortunately often been something that scares people or that makes them uneasy, and their response to that is not always a good response. And in many cases, it created biases, and Black people throughout the world, and women especially, have often been, unfortunately, the target of these biases. So in Black History Month, we talked a lot about the achievements of Black people throughout history, especially in the United States. In March, we're going to talk about the achievements of women throughout history. And so we have a lot of great programming coming. I really encourage you to check out the Facebook page for Almaty American Space. You'll see a weekly calendar there. In addition to that, we're going to be joining the global campaign for #ChooseToChallenge, which is about challenging inequality and, in this case, gender bias. And we're also going to have a new look. So for those of you who are not aware, American Space Almaty is open. You can visit American Space Almaty. You can use the resources. You just have to register, and then you can visit us. And we're going to have a new look. So for those of you who have been to the space within the last year, you've seen our Space Week and our images, which are really beautiful, but we're changing those out. And so come on in and take a look at those. With that, I would like to welcome Stephen for another one of his fantastic talks. And with Stephen, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for the introduction. I want to begin by thanking the American Consulate in Almaty and everybody associated with these talks and making them possible. That includes Tracy, Aaliyah, our moderator, Elmira, and Consul General Eric Meyer. It's a unusual opportunity to be able to present the philosophical perspective on issues of all character, all variety, and to show the power and the value that philosophy can bring to the understanding of these issues and ultimately to their resolution. So with that, I'd like to sketch out a little bit of the format for this talk. I've been asked a number of times to begin by at least relating the questions that I'll be discussing at the end of the talk, the questions that were presented at the end of last week's talk that I didn't have time to go over. Those questions for this week will include, let me just reference them. Why people pursue riches over happiness, why we have difficulty defining our goals, and the difference between the biological and philosophical perspectives on life. In addition to those questions, I'll address, if we have time, any questions that you might pose in the course of this evening's, or well, it's evening for me, I'm in Los Angeles, but the morning's talk, you know, for many of you. If we don't have time to address additional questions, we'll do that next week. That's our, you know, custom, you know, in general. And I think that's that sets things up. So the talk this week, the title is The Dignity of Difference, and a little more on happiness. Last week's talk dealt primarily on happiness, on that issue, I want to add a few more comments at the end, to that tonight. Okay. At the beginning of the pandemic, a year ago or so now, an article appeared in the New York Times on Shakespeare's play King Lear. King Lear was written during a pandemic about 400 years ago, an outbreak of plague, bubonic plague. Actually, bubonic plague, which originated in the middle of the 14th century, lasted by many accounts about 400 years, and there were successive outbreaks. King Lear was written during one of those. That, I think, inspired this particular article. The focus of the article was on Shakespeare's commitment to individuality, that his characters were not types, but were fully realized human beings, especially his male characters. Shakespeare's representation of women is not quite as detailed, not quite as intuitive. But what was interesting about the article was not so much what it contained as what it left out. And what that particular article left out has also been left out of every other article I've ever read on King Lear. King Lear is considered one of the greatest works in the literature of the world. Many people consider it Shakespeare's greatest play. To be the greatest play by perhaps the greatest of all writers gives King Lear a special stature, right, in literature. In fact, John Keats, the English poet, whose the 200th anniversary of his death was just a couple weeks ago, would always reread King Lear before undertaking any major poetic project of his own. So King Lear has an extraordinary stature. So I've read a lot of articles over the years on the play, but for as astute as many of these articles are, and as penetrating as the perspectives and the insights they provide, they fail to mention what is arguably the single most important line in the play. And it's not just arguably the single most important line in King Lear. It's a candidate for the single most important line ever written. And that is a line that's delivered by the king's counselor, Kent, to the king. The line is, "I'll teach you differences." Now, to have a little bit more appreciation of the magnitude of that line, the philosopher Wittgenstein, the Austrian English philosopher, considered by many the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, possibly the greatest philosopher since Kant, Immanuel Kant, maybe one of the three greatest philosophers, along with Aristotle, who ever lived. And in fact, was considered by Bertrand Russell, who knew everyone of intellectual stature in the 20th century, to have been the most powerful mind he had ever encountered. And he encountered them all. Bertrand Russell knew Einstein, Heisenberg, Gödel, von Neumann. But Wittgenstein was the intelligence that he thought was the most commanding, the most penetrating. Well, Wittgenstein only wrote two major works. One was a work that was published early in his life. It's called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It's a work whose major results and insights he repudiated. Later, in his career with a work that was published posthumously, the Philosophical Investigations. The Philosophical Investigations ranks as one of those important works in the history of philosophy. Well, Wittgenstein liked to begin works with a quotation. He began the Philosophical Investigations with a quotation from the Austrian playwright Nestroy. It's in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually is. It's a statement of humility. But Wittgenstein said he had considered using that quotation from Lear, "I'll teach you differences." And I think maybe the reason that he didn't, well, first of all, it has something of a domineering tone to it, right? It's a little bit of an aggressive type of line, but also it's possible that Wittgenstein's work hadn't quite reached the level in his, in his own estimation where that line summarized it fully. Well, in my work, it summarizes philosophy completely. Philosophy, quite simply, is the limit of rigor. Now, I know the term philosophy is not necessarily like as widely embraced as it might have been 2,000 years ago, right? In the time of the Greeks, or even in 19th or 18th century continental Europe. I don't really need to use the word philosophy. Rigor is enough. It captures what philosophy is. Philosophy is the limit of rigor, and rigor is a term that is in present use and of high esteem. In the sciences, in mathematics, in many areas of contemporary life and culture, to call a result rigorous is to give it the highest possible praise. Well, philosophy operates at the extreme limit of rigor. When one hears of like a rigorous result in the sciences, from the perspective of philosophy, those results aren't rigorous at all. And they're not rigorous in relation to science for a simple but fundamental reason. And that is science, much of science, is based upon the ability to execute controlled experiments. But rigorously controlled experiments are theoretically impossible. And controlled experiments are theoretically impossible for a number of reasons that go to the very nature of our experience of the world. One of the most important, one of the simplest to express is the world is different in different directions. That asymmetry means that whatever our experimental and control groups are will be occupying different types of spaces, different types of environments. And from the standpoint of rigor, at its limit, any difference is decisive. Any difference is sufficient to undermine any comparison that one would like to make. One can make the comparison for certain purposes, but in terms of rigor, any difference blocks the application of one result or conclusion to something that's different in any possible way. And it turns out it goes even deeper than that even if the world were identical in every direction, even if the space that we were occupying was perfectly symmetrical, just the notion of direction itself, of one object being in one direction, another object being in a different direction, would mean, again, theoretically, Whatever applies to one need not rigorously apply to the other. That distinction, whatever it is, that allows us to say that we have two objects or 2 points or 2 individuals is what we call in science the confounding variable that can never be eliminated, that makes it impossible to draw a fully rigorous conclusion. There was an article, I think this week, on the bbc.com website on the question, can physics prove God? Well, physics, science generally, cannot prove anything. It doesn't rise to that level of rigor for a number of reasons. The example I was just giving, also past cannot guarantee the future. That's something that's been appreciated in philosophy since the 18th century, the time of David Hume, the greatest philosopher to write in English. Past cannot guarantee the future. So whatever the generalizations that we incorporate into our fundamental laws of understanding of the laws of nature, our sense of physical principles need not continue to apply the next moment rigorously. And again, any difference between this moment and the moment to come is enough to undermine the strength of whatever type of claim we would like to make. Doesn't rise to the level of rigor. Now, what exactly is rigor? Well, one way to describe it is it's what's incontrovertible, incontestable, what cannot possibly be denied. It usually relates to the nature of our concepts. Propositions that rise to that level, past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Is this world real or dream? If one day we awaken to a totally different reality that persists, this was dream. The future decides. Reality is a term of comparison. But another way to give rigor content, to discuss what its actual nature is that rigor is of difference. Any 2 objects, any 2 individuals are approximately the same for some purpose, rigorously different. We exist in difference from everything else. It is the nature of existence itself that every object is distinguishable in some way. Existence per se, existence in its essence, is about difference. It is the fact that we exist in difference from everything else. That means, in principle, each one of us is irreplaceable. You sometimes hear within social contexts that everybody's replaceable. Everybody might be replaceable for some specific kind of role that they might be asked to occupy or perform. But again, only even when we're talking about roles, approximately so. Again, 2 things are approximately the same at best, rigorously different. So it turns out, based on this analysis, the analysis from the perspective of rigor, and one of the things to keep in mind with the perspective of rigor, the limit of rigor is it's the strongest possible perspective that there is. There is nothing stronger than its limit. All the weapons in the world are not as strong as the limit of rigor in terms of what it can do and what its implications are throughout all aspects of human life and experience. And how strong is it? How strong is philosophy exercising that rigor? Well, philosophy created science. It's that strong. The greatest achievements of modern physics, relativity theory, quantum mechanics, the work of Einstein, Heisenberg, was guided by philosophy, by the notion that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside. They are fundamentally philosophical formulations of the physics of what it is to be in this world, observing it from where we are. So philosophy has devastating power and liberating power, and the power to guarantee our dignity against all possible assaults or affronts, because that level of logic, that level of rigor is almost, we can say by definition, stronger than anything that would threaten it. There's a line from the 19th century American philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. It comes in the conclusion of his famous work, Walden. It goes, rather than love or money or fame, give me truth. Well, the highest truth, incontrovertible truth, is truth that operates at the limit of an incontestable rigor. And that truth is of difference. So we exist in difference from everything else. It is our fundamental dignity in that we are irreplaceable, not exchangeable. It's something that we see examples of historically. Sometimes, I have a background in molecular biology, and sometimes I'm asked, why we don't have a fully realized cancer cure at this point. At this point in the history of culture, we've certainly been pursuing it, for millennia. Well, one explanation is a Roman soldier, against orders, slew Archimedes. Archimedes was the greatest mathematician of antiquity, one of the three greatest mathematicians who ever lived. When he was killed, he was developing what's now known as calculus. It took 2,000 years for his successor to emerge, someone who could continue that work. People are not readily replaceable. The person that emerged to continue his work was Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is considered not just perhaps the greatest figure in the history of science, maybe in the history of physics, but one of the three greatest mathematicians, along with Archimedes and the German mathematician Gauss, who ever lived. When Einstein looked into Newton's work, Einstein was overwhelmed. He couldn't believe the capacity of that mind. Well, the young Newton constructed the first reflecting telescope, and he brought it to the British Royal Society to applause. And everybody was pleased with what he had fashioned by hand, from his own sort of study of the nature of light. But then Newton wanted to read a paper on the nature of the light, on optics, which he was given permission to do to the British Society. That reading was met with ridicule, with laughter, because the basic ideas within it ran counter to the views of the president of the Royal Society at the time, Robert Huck. Newton was humiliated. He left London, went back to Cambridge, resolving never to publish again. Well, he maintained that commitment for 20 years. He sat on the scientific revolution for 20 years until a diplomat, an English diplomat, Edmund Halley, the person for whom Halley's Comet is named. He was actually also an amateur astronomer, went and sought out Newton. He cajoled him. Yeah, as a diplomat, he was able to manage difficult personalities, which Newton certainly was. He guided him. He financed the writing and the publication of the Principia, Newton's great work that established modern physics. It began in earnest the scientific revolution. It led to the Industrial Revolution. Without Halley's work, without that intervention, Newton, who had, recoiled, from ridicule, without Halley's rescuing Newton, from his resolve, not only might there not have been a scientific revolution or an industrial revolution, but it's quite likely that the person tonight delivering this talk and the vast majority of people who are listening to this talk would never have been born. Newton, not replaceable either. And finally, Lavoisier was the creator of modern quantitative chemistry. He was also an aristocrat and a tax collector under the French Ancien Régime, the regime that was overthrown by the French Revolution. Lavoisier was guillotined during the French Revolution. While that was happening, somebody in the crowd, the assembled crowd to observe, commented that it will take a century to replace that mind that we lose in a second. Well, we're still waiting. So we lose 2,000 years from Archimedes to Newton. We lose a generation as Newton sat on results, and we lose Lavoisier. There, that's a reasonable explanation. So the point is, people are not replaceable, and we have to take care in appreciating that circumstance, about human beings. It's our uniqueness and our differences that put us in a position to make unique contributions. And those differences are not just our birthright. They're not just the guarantee of our irreplaceability. It is through those differences that each of us exists at all. Among the uniqueness of our circumstance, if you look around, whatever you're seeing right now has not been seen in detail by anyone else in the history of the world, in the history of existence, and will never be in detail experienced as you are experiencing it right now again. Not ever. In terms of the dignity of your circumstance, well, there's a question. We've heard the theory of the Big Bang, the most, embraced theory of the origin of the universe. Well, there's a question, where did the Big Bang happen? The answer is, it's embraced in physics, but it's a somewhat philosophical answer, actually. The Big Bang happened everywhere. The Big Bang happened where you are. The Big Bang happened where I am. Now, not only is where each of us presently occupies space the point of origin of everything, It's also the center and a point of stillness. That's the result of Einstein's work. That's the result of the circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, even though we imagine that we can. We customarily think of the world as independently existing. We think of reality as what exists and persists independently of ourselves. We have this almost third-person view of experience, where we're seeing the world customarily in the way a novelist writing in the third person does. And we imagine being able to see in and through everything. We imagine we can assess the capabilities of others. This is a fundamental and profound illusion. We can't be guarantors of what we ourselves are capable of. And I'll go into that in just a second. I wanted to make a point about this, the distinctiveness, the value of, again, the differences that distinguish us. There are lots of affirmations of the value of such difference. One such affirmation comes from the famous American actor, Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep is talked about, and one hears this on the part of other, successful people as well. Having been told early on in her career that certain things about herself needed to be changed. I think maybe there were comments at some point about her nose or about other aspects, of her demeanor. Well, rather than change those aspects, Meryl Streep decided consciously to embrace them. Well, embracing aspects that were unique to herself, she concluded, was one of the keys to her success. That it's what is distinctively true or distinctively realized in yourself that makes, again, you invaluable. There's a famous comment in the Chinese word, the I Ching, make yourself indispensable. Well, we don't have to make ourselves indispensable. We are, by virtue of everything that distinguishes us from everyone else and everything else. Again, that is our birthright, that is our dignity, that ultimately is our happiness. And it is, to use religious terms, it is the basis for our salvation. In that whatever applies to anyone else need not rigorously, again, I'm operating within, philosophical perspective here. So whatever distinguishes us from anyone else, anything else, means that whatever applies to anyone else need not, again, rigorously apply to us. That includes notions of mortality, disease, old age, death. The Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha Gautama, was interested in ending disease, old age, and death, finding a way out of what seemed like an oppressive, an intolerable, destiny for humanity. Well, he was able to achieve a result by eliminating not disease, old age, and death in a laboratory, but by eliminating the concepts through a process actually that we've talked about before. There's a logic within Buddhism. The real lasts. Under the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha had the insight, nothing lasts. Therefore, nothing is real, including disease, old age, and death. Now that actually is a slightly problematic formulation, simply that we can't know that nothing lasts. It's a belief. And so Buddhism is a religion. philosophy does not embrace any belief or opinion or theory or assumption or point of view. It stands on an incontestable rigor. So, and rigorously, we can achieve a similar result. You can't rigorously know that you will die. You cannot claim, to be subject to mortality per se, because again, you differ, at least in one way, that you're here, not wherever anyone else has ever been. That difference, again, within a rigorous representation is enough to allow us to escape the concept. It's a powerful notion. The concept of rigor is probably the best way to appreciate the nature of God itself, or himself, or herself. God is likely an instrument of the elaboration of rigor. Certainly, existence itself attests to that. That, again, the fundamental nature of existence, we exist in difference from anything else. We are approximately the same, right? But rigorously different. Now, that sort of has a slightly mathematical, I think, feel to it, possibly. And in fact, those words are capable, and those ideas are capable of a mathematical formulation. Not to scare you, but just to show you that things can be sort of distilled to forms that are simple but powerful in their implications. And I will show you. Here, we have a mathematical representation of what I was just saying. But again, not to be scared by it. H is what I call a heuristic space. That's the space in which any two things are approximately the same. Two chairs, approximately the same. It's our conceptual space. It's the space of science and technology. Technology elaborates objects. We manufacture iPhones that are approximately the same. The parts of an iPhone are the same within tolerances. They're interchangeable within those tolerances. Well, within a heuristic space, A equals A. Two things can be equal. Now, notice I'm saying A equals C, not A equals B. There's a technical reason for that, but the point is a heuristic space is the space of approximation that is everything except what philosophy is at its limit of rigor. So the sciences operate within a heuristic space where, again, two things are approximately the same so that they can carry out within science a controlled experiment and get approximate results. Within language, we are grouping things together based upon similarities, family resemblances. Objects are called balls if they, have certain characteristics in common. They don't have to have exactly one characteristic running through. We sometimes think of balls as round, but footballs are not. But footballs have enough resemblances to what we otherwise call a ball that the term applies to that form as well. But these are approximate similarities for certain purposes, mainly for purposes of promoting survival, right? It's useful for us to know that a hot stove burns and so should be avoided. And anything resembling a hot stove should therefore be avoided, okay? The human mind is a heuristic instrument. It's grouping things together based upon such similarities for purposes of survival. Okay? It's an inevitable aspect of the human mind. The human mind is simplifying, right? It is approximating. it's, from the standpoint of rigor, oversimplifying, right? Now, it's our very tendency to conceptualize based upon various kinds of similarities, right? That leads to speaking in terms of races, of ethnic groups, of genders, right? We are grouping together based upon certain similarities, superficial, approximate sort of characteristics. That's the basis ultimately of stereotyping. It is what the human mind is given to doing. Fortune, and clearly it's the basis ultimately of the kinds of biases and prejudices that are so much a part of human experience, human culture historically, right? We generalize, and then we think that the characteristics that apply to a certain number of elements of a set apply to all possible elements. Well, we're oversimplifying. We are overlooking the particularities of each case. We are conceptualizing and grouping and clustering together. But what we are doing is not operating within the constraints of rigor. And so rigor is stronger than those kinds of processes, those kinds of mental processes. Rigor can stand up against the tendency to elaborate biases, because a bias based upon some set of past experiences cannot stand up to the criticism that any difference means that what assessment has been applied to one individual or one circumstance must apply to another. Rigor says no. It's rigor that is strong enough to stop the process of the elaboration of biases and prejudices and premature assessments and unjustifiable conclusions. That is a prevalent, a dominating aspect of human life. The only force that is strong enough to resist it is the philosophical impulse of a rigorous assessment and evaluation. It can rescue us, from those inevitable temptations of mind, but that nevertheless are not inevitable in the face of a greater rigor. So back to this second. So heuristic space is the space of approximate similarities. It's the space of, again, of science, of technology, of language, right? Language, its concepts are clustering based on similarities. A philosophic space, a rigorous space, what I actually call an epistemic space, because it relates to a direct knowledge of something that is incontestable in some way. The condition of that, A is not equal to A. That's a condition of difference, of distinction. That's the fundamental condition of philosophic reality. That's the fundamental condition of reality itself. Again, it's a way of stating that we exist in difference from everything else. There's a third relationship here about the connection between the heuristic and the epistemic. I think I'll leave that for another time, but the most important aspect of this is that we exist fundamentally in epistemic space. And epistemic space is one in which any two points that are distinguishable in any way, and that means whatever allows us to say that there are two and not one, is enough to mean that whatever applies to one need not necessarily apply to the other. Rigor, in this way, blocks judgment. There's a religious prescription, right? Certainly in the Christian tradition, you shall not judge. Well, comes across as a commandment, right? A divine order of sorts, right? Judgment is not compatible with rigor. One doesn't have to embrace a belief. One doesn't have to embrace a specific divinity or the prescriptions of a specific divinity in order to withdraw from judgment. One just has to embrace philosophical rigor. We hear, for example, that in order to assess, to judge someone, you have to walk in their shoes. Well, for one thing, it's not enough to walk in someone's shoes, right? There's still too many differences that pertain. One can say, well, what if one could occupy someone else's skin? Well, again, from the standpoint of rigor, it would be necessary to occupy someone's skin from the moment of their birth and not occupy your own skin ever, at all. In other words, the only way you can legitimately assess, rigorously assess, is if you were that person, never yourself. The extremity of rigor is of such a nature that not even God can judge. You know, that sounds like an extraordinary statement to make, but really, any difference between God and ourselves means that he or she or it would not be able rigorously to know or assess our circumstances. That's an illustration of the extremity of rigor. It's strange. It's not something that we normally think in terms of or deal with, but it is fundamental to philosophy at its highest and deepest and most powerful. It is the key to everything that philosophy is capable of doing for us. It is the key to, well, philosophy's ability to realize that truth that sets us free. We talked previously about how rigor, as I'm describing it, sets us free from pain, suffering, expectation, the past, indignity, limitations of any kind. So again, we're dealing with something of extraordinary power that should be used and appreciated for how it can liberate us from any sense of limitation. Eleanor Roosevelt once famously remarked that no one can humiliate a person without that person's consent. You have to be sort of participating in the process. Well, no one rigorously can assess, intuit, evaluate our circumstances to allow them to confer a judgment that would stand up against, again, a rigorous assessment. So the power, again, is formidable. Let's see if one thing, when we're talking about like that epistemic sort of reality, that space that's defined by philosophic rigor, it's actually a strange space. It's not what we are seeing around us. What we are seeing with normal eyes are familiar objects. And familiar objects are familiar based upon their resemblances, right, to past forms of that object or to similar such things. Well, a rigorous space, an epistemic space, is one that doesn't recognize relationships, doesn't recognize similarities. And so it's actually present all around us. It's the fundamental space in which we exist. It's, again, we exist in difference from everything else. It is what defines us, that space. How do you, what form does it take? Well, when people talk about being in the moment, they're talking about not thinking back on the past. They're talking about not anticipating the future. From a philosophic standpoint, again, standpoint of rigor, that's all philosophy is. We can't be certain of the past from where we stand. And again, as I said in aphorisms, past can't guarantee the future. The future decides the past, can change it. We certainly can't be certain of what's to come, right? Hasn't happened yet. It can, in principle, take any possible form. Again, rigorously. But the present moment is actually even more than just the elimination of past senses or claims or judgments and future expectation. The experience of the objects that we see around us is infused by our past experiences. The actual present epistemic reality becomes apparent when everything around you becomes unfamiliar. I talk about rigor representing the landscape of Eden. The landscape of Eden is everywhere around us. It is strange and beautiful and new. And we approach it and can see it when we see beyond the approximations of heuristic space, the approximations, the similarities that, again, represent oversimplifications, of experience. There are a lot of testimonials about the value of our unique circumstance and our obligations to that circumstance. And again, the dignity of it. There is another 19th century philosopher, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's somebody that I read a good deal when I was in college for one reason. The philosophy building, Harvard University has an actual building devoted to philosophy. It's not all that common among universities, these days. But the philosophy building at Harvard is named for Emerson. It's Emerson Hall. And I probably spent more time there than any other single location when I was in college. Well, Emerson famously wrote, and I think, speak what you think now in hard words. And tomorrow, speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words, though it contradict everything you said today. Well, then I'll be sure to be misunderstood. Is it so bad to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. It's our birthright to be true to what we see, what we experience, that no one else is privy to from where we stand. It's, again, why no one can rigorously judge our experience, our sense of things. We can learn from other people's perspectives heuristically. We can kind of add it, to our sense of things. We can sort of play with it in our minds. We can imagine, other people's views of the world. But what we must always decisively remember is that where we are is our birthright. And where we are is distinguished from everything, everyone else in its detail and in its rigor. And again, that's our circumstance, that's the nature of existence itself, that is our dignity, our irreplaceability. It is ultimately our freedom and our salvation. It's that strong, and it is stronger than anything that can contend with it or contrive to deny it, including any affronts to our own dignity. Okay? Thoreau, I mentioned earlier, he said something. Thoreau and Emerson actually were connected. Emerson was older, had a fairly established reputation. They were, both Emerson and Thoreau were at Harvard. Thoreau, in fact, lived on my floor, the room across from me, 150 years earlier, when I was at Harvard. In my room as a freshman, that room that was across the hall from where Thoreau had lived, I had a poster of Walden Pond. And on that post, Walden Pond was actually a part of Emerson's property that Thoreau had gone off to do his experiment in intensive living. That became the basis for one of the great works of world literature, world philosophy, American literature and philosophy, Walden. In that print that I had of Walden Pond, there was a quotation, a famous quotation from Thoreau that I saw daily. And it's music, and it has a reference to music that ran through my mind. The quotation goes, and I'm going to actually paraphrase it just slightly. If you do not keep pace with your companions, your contemporaries, perhaps it is because you hear a different drummer. Step to the music that you hear, however distant or far away, however measured or far away. It's again a statement of the fundamental responsibility that we have to honor and embrace our distinctive circumstances. Another example of the value, the significance, the decisive significance of that embrace is provided by Emily Dickinson, another great American writer from the same period. Emily Dickinson lived in New England. She was actually part of an intellectual family and moved through an intellectual circle of people in the culture. She wrote, in the course of her lifetime, over 1,700 poems. I consider Emily Dickinson is my favorite poet. I consider her arguably the greatest of all poets of any language at any time. Many consider her the greatest of all American poets, but again, for me, her embodiment and exemplification of the poetic spirit is unrivaled. And she's been a major influence upon my work, both philosophically and, well, I write poetry as well, on my poetic expression. My very first poems almost could be mistaken for, you know, some early pieces by Emily Dickinson. But Emily Dickinson lived a fairly sheltered life. In the course of her lifetime, she only published 8 poems in some random publications. She was basically unknown, completely unknown by her contemporaries. But she wasn't always willingly, you know, accepting that obscurity. And at some point, she reached out to a contemporary literary critic, T.W. Higginson. Again, she had family connections. She moved within, you know, cultured circles, so she had access. So she reached out to Higginson, hoping that he might be able to, you know, embrace her work, maybe endorse it, maybe help facilitate publication. She sent him a short, small collection of poems, you know, sample of her work poems that she was proud of, poems that are now celebrated poems. Higginson responded. He didn't embrace her. He didn't embrace her work. He, in fact, wasn't even sure that what she was writing was poetry. She was devastated. She gave up her ambition to more broadly disseminate her work. She died unknown. It was her sister who collected her works. Her sister didn't even realize what, you know, what a magnitude of achievement, you know, Emily Dickinson had produced during her lifetime. But the point is that Emily Dickinson was so true to her impulses, her demands, her art. Had she compromised it in response to the criticism of Higginson, we probably would never have heard of Emily Dickinson. But the fact of the matter is, by remaining true to her poetic impulses and pursuing her vision and realizing her poetic instincts, she achieved a level of success far beyond anything that a Higginson had ever encountered. So this issue of being true to oneself, one's circumstances, one's impulses, that one cannot be judged because no one can know our circumstances, you know, sufficiently to render a judgment that can stand up against the barrier that rigor provides. It's a more powerful force. This notion I made a reference in the summary to courage, to the courage to be. A book, actually. It's the title of a book by a 20th century theologian, philosopher, Paul Tillich. He was inspired by, as many people have been, by the work of Aristotle. For Aristotle, courage, the courage to act in any particular direction, under any set of pressures, was the supreme virtue, the indispensable virtue, that without courage, one would not have the fortitude to enact any other virtues. Paul Tillich emphasized, again, the courage to be oneself. He was something of an existentialist in his orientation. to embrace the uniqueness of one's circumstances and to embrace it in the face of all the efforts on the part of people, of society, to suppress whatever one's individual impulses might be that might run counter to the norm, to the generality. What's interesting, though, is that as important a virtue as courage is, as commanding a virtue as it is, doesn't rise to the power or the strength of rigor. Within the embrace of rigor, courage becomes superfluous in the sense that no one, again, from a rigorous perspective, can judge an individual. No one can say what that person's circumstances really are or limitations may actually be. No one is in that position. No one can see the world from the outside. No one can see how things are going to unfold to be able to predict or assess. So one doesn't so much need courage. One just needs to embrace the rigor of our circumstances and their uniqueness. There's the best example, I think, of that might be Van Gogh. And Van Gogh, at the beginning of his artistic career, showed, and Van Gogh turned to art when he was 27. He had been a pastor, but gave up that career. He wasn't really succeeding at it and decided to undertake art, again, at the age of 27. He could not draw, displayed no talent from the outset. If a drawing instructor had been asked to appraise his work, it would have been a horrifically negative appraisal. We would say at that point, Van Gogh had no future as an artist. Well, Van Gogh devoted himself for the next 10 years assiduously to art, devoted himself with a singular purpose and commitment that within 10 years, Van Gogh would die, but his art would emerge as perhaps the work of the most popular great painter to ever live. And I've spoken with drawing instructors. They consider the three greatest draftsmen of all time to have been Michelangelo, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh. So that was somebody starting from no apparent talent. So that's the degree to which one can't assess, one can't limit, one can't impose, upon others, nor upon ourselves. We don't know what we're capable of until we exemplify, those results, those abilities. Before I end, what I wanted to do was to read as I did last time, a poetic version of what I've been expressing tonight. It's very concentrated, it's philosophically concentrated, but since it's also in a poetic form, it's doubly concentrated. So I'm not reading this so much for the ideas to be communicated in what I'm reading, but for you to get a feel for the music, of this mode of communication. The music that conveys some of the spirit, of the ideas that I've been discussing. So let me, this I do have to read. So and then we will go to questions. Okay. Now, the book is actually entitled, this comes up at the end, This Relationship, but don't be scared by it. The A is what I now call epistemic space. That's where no two things can be the same, right? That's the space distinguished by difference. That's the space in which we exist. This NA is that heuristic space where two things can be approximately the same. So here, this refers to a space where two things are approximately the same. Here, any two things are rigorously different. This is where we exist. This is where we, well, suffer. This refers to our overall conceptual space, but not important. Just keep in mind, this is just a representation of what I had shown you earlier. And let's see where it is. It's just another way of formulating this, which is basically just what I was explaining tonight. I read it A, B, and A, colon, C, okay? It was an earlier formulation. So the book actually is entitled that, and here it is. Epistemic arrays diverge. Heuristic relations merge. Existences self-justify to claim. Identities apportion to name. Believing to salvation, we mythologize damnation. Dignities, particularities, distance disparities. Existence to redemption, singularities perfection. Solutions to worlds bear the dignities they honor. Savaging the cares of symmetries to conquer. In soliloquy to tranquility of eternity shown stronger. That A, B, and A, colon, C. So again, the sound of it communicates some of, I think, the force of the ideas that rigor represents and that philosophy embraces. And that is the key to our existence, our dignity, ultimately what religions term our salvation. Okay? So with that, let me address questions from last time. Let me just see where we're standing in terms of time. Okay, we have time. Okay, so first question from last time. Why do people pursue riches over happiness? Number of aspects to this. First of all, I've mentioned before that happiness in general is not something that we so much pursue as something that we experience while we are in pursuit of something else. It's ultimately a matter of engagement. Now, that actually, I didn't quite get to address this at the end of the talk I wanted to, so I'll address it right here, that I mentioned that one of our fundamental illusions is the sense that we can see the world from the outside. Cannot do that. When we are disengaged in that way, when we are self-conscious, when we are bored, not engaged, in some set of experiences, some activities, that's when happiness enters the picture. When we are engaged, we are capable of experiencing, being, as it were, embraced by happiness. But it's a matter of engagement. It's a matter of really recognizing the true nature of our circumstances, embracing where we are, what we are, and that we cannot leave this set of circumstances and view the world independently of ourselves. It's our fundamental birthright that we not do that. So, happiness in general is not something pursued. Now, people do pursue riches. Often it's fear, the sense that riches are able to protect us in some way. Again, the strongest of all places, spaces to occupy is that of philosophic rigor, as remember what I quoted earlier from Thoreau, in place of love or riches, money, or fame give me truth. Truth has that power. It's truth. It's truth at the level of philosophic rigor that is the ultimate security, stronger than any type of material riches can provide. But it's not always so accessible, right? One has to be introduced to it, introduced to the ideas, as these talks are introducing people, to these ideas. One aspect of that question, it seemed to me that, well, when I was younger, I used to think, if we lived 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, to have a comfortable life, we needed to be wealthy. Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, lived into his early 80s, but he was from the aristocracy. He was from a wealthy family. You could live a long life if you had that type of support, if you had that type of privilege. But now, the nature of modern society, industrialization, of manufacturing, without extravagant means, one can live comfortably, reasonably comfortably. One can clothe oneself. One can take advantage of the abundance that modern society can produce through its technologies, its manufacturing capabilities, and not need the kind of material extravagances that were essential for just living a life of reasonable longevity 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. So my feeling has always been take advantage of the abundance in principle of modern society to free us from the need to accumulate the type of wealth that was essential to longevity in the past. So, a few comments about that. Why can't we define our main goals? Well, okay, now I was a little bit unclear on this question. For one thing, if we're talking about collective goals, well, we're talking about what pertains to heuristic space. Society operates within such space. Collective goals don't quite recognize the particularities, the specificities of an individual circumstance that is so essential to the perspective of philosophy. I think I mentioned, maybe it was last time, that the philosopher Kierkegaard said on his tombstone, only 2 words were necessary: the individual. So from a philosophical standpoint, I'm going to answer this from that perspective. One has to be true to one's own circumstances in defining one's goals. Now, one of the best guidelines to that end is a Hindu proverb: you become what you admire. So I always encourage people to try to seek that out. I emphasize the importance of coming to terms with this philosophical perspective that I've been articulating, understand the nature of our existence, the nature of our uniqueness, the nature of our singularity, understand, that we can not properly judge someone else, nor can they us. And so act independently of that type of judgment, look into ourselves, look into our experience, assess what we genuinely admire, and go in the direction of that. That is the only kind of success, the only kind of goal that ultimately is fulfilling. A goal, a direction that is unique to our own nature and our own circumstances. And that is something that we can only come to. We can only glean ourselves. That's part of the burden of the Delphic oracle, that Greek Delphic oracle admonition, know thyself. That's all you can ever genuinely know. That's all you can only philosophically, rigorously know, because that's all you have direct access to. Everything else is heuristic. It's guesswork. It's a matter of belief, not certainty. And then the difference between biological and philosophical views of life. Okay. Clearly, as I've been emphasizing, there's a fundamental and profound difference between philosophy as an activity and every other human activity. Philosophy is defined by this demand of incontestability, right? Of incontrovertibility, of this limiting rigor. Philosophic space is not a conceptual space, right? Conceptual space, concepts operate within heuristic space. That's the space that clusters things together for various purposes. That's the nature of concepts themselves. It's a convergent space, right? I've mentioned before that an object, for example, a chair, is a convergence of past experience, present sensation, future expectation. Heuristic space, the space in which science operates, technology operates, is a convergent space. A goal is something that we achieve convergently by doing something repeatedly. That repetition is a mode of convergence, or bringing various elements together to help us achieve a given result or a given goal. If we want to develop vaccines, we bring individuals together. We bring certain levels of expertise. We create laboratories. We bring knowledge to bear. It's a convergent process. Creativity in general, doing an artwork, is a matter of bringing elements together. Writing a book, writing a poem, we're bringing elements together, words together in sequence. Those are convergent structures. Biology operates within that space. I've mentioned before that a definition of life from a biological standpoint is that of a high order of complexity, molecular complexity that is sustained by an input of energy. Energy helps maintain order that would otherwise over time degenerate. A bedroom that isn't on a regular basis sort of organized, tidied up, becomes messy, right? Living things without an input of energy to maintain a highly ordered state will eventually decay. So that's sort of the biological sense, complex systems. But notice, from a biological standpoint, we're dealing with convergences, convergent structures, right? Molecules come together, complex molecular arrangements, macromolecules, proteins, and nucleic acids and lipids that all have complex, or in principle, complex structures, highly ordered, okay, highly maintained. Well, if we're dealing with a convergent system, we're in heuristic space. That is not philosophic space per se, by its nature. Philosophic space is divergent, and a philosophic space is not a conceptual space, doesn't have concepts ultimately within it. So from a philosophical standpoint, well, there are no words for life. Okay, we embody it. You can only act now in terms of when we think of of life, if we're thinking of, let's say, a consciousness, like an inner life, we can only be certain of that, in our own case, right? In the case of, I've mentioned before that language exists not as an instrument of communication, but of coordination, of social facilitation. If we were not communicating with other human beings, if for some reason language didn't exist and communicative modalities didn't exist in any form, we would not think that other people had consciousness as we do, had an inner life as we do. We tend to wonder if animals have such an inner life, a consciousness. That's because we're not communicating with them. To the degree that we do, we will begin to, when we communicate with pets, with dogs, with cats, we begin in the process of that communication to experience the aura of a consciousness, a kind of inner consciousness that is pertaining to that individual, to that form. But that's really an artifact of communication itself, and communication is facilitated by language whose ultimate purpose is to achieve social cooperation, our ability to work together in social groups that facilitate our survival historically. Okay, so a little bit on those questions, and let's see, do we have any questions for tonight? We have a few minutes left.
Thank you very much for the talk, Stephen. Thank you for answering the questions and clarifying all of them. So far lately, we have got a lot of nice feedbacks for our talks. And also we have got one and the only question from today, which is from Shirangul, actually. Shirangul, yeah. So she says, hello, everyone. Thank you, Stephen and A.S. Almada, for these talks. I have a question. Isn't that the reality is an individual thing?
The reality, yes. Yeah, I will say yes, in the sense that our normal notion of reality, well, our sense of reality, like in the sciences, is of the world seen from the outside. But yes, it's like what's extremely important from a philosophical standpoint is that we can only see the world through our own eyes. And so ultimately, our sense of things is going to be based upon our experience. And that, again, is our dignity. That's the dignity of our circumstances. And that goes deep into the nature of existence itself. And that's something that we want to become increasingly aware of, that each of us represents, from where we stand or sit, the culmination of the entire history of existence. And furthermore, not only do we summarize, the history of existence, where we are, we represent the center and the still center of this world. So our fundamental responsibility is to be true to the circumstances as they present themselves to us, and respond to whatever presents as the need in those circumstances, given whatever our nature is. But yes, ultimately, we cannot ever enter someone else's consciousness. We cannot ever see the world from their perspective. And so any claims that we make about reality from someone else's perspective will be what I call heuristic. They will be beliefs. They will not rise to the level of an incontrovertible rigor. And so in the end, they will not be decisive for us. They can help us. They can sort of inspire us to start thinking about things in different ways than we might otherwise have been thinking. But our ultimate responsibility is to the circumstance of the world as it presents itself to us. and we can never leave our circumstances to view them from outside the world or from anyone else's perspective. That's why we cannot judge another person. We can't know their circumstances in sufficiently intimate detail, nor can we be judged. Not legitimately, not rigorously. No one can challenge our perspective or our dignity as long as it's honest. We just have to be honest with ourselves. That's our fundamental responsibility.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharangul, for your question. And thank you for your thanks. Unfortunately, our time is up, but we are all welcoming you all next week as well to our philosophical talks on Friday at 11 a.m. Almaty time. And first we finish, we would like to thank the U.S. General Consulate in Almaty and American Space in Almaty for organizing this event. And thank you very much, Stephen, for giving such amazing talks and for choosing the topic and answering the questions. So please feel free to ask questions as well. We will definitely be answering them next session. So have a great week, stay safe, and thank you very much for everyone who joined us today.
Thank you very much, and I will see you next week. I hope you join us again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stay all safe and see you next week.